I'm beginning to encounter more issues in my design due to the limitations of what hooks and subscriptions base mod makes available. Rather than rushing headlong into base mod's code and trying to remedy these, I've been exploring some workaround options. Before we get into cards, I want to advocate for decompiling Slay the Spire. This sounds intimidating, but it's actually quite easy. This will allow us to see the actual implementation of existing cards, so we can better understand the best ways to implement our designs. You'll need to download the JD GUI Java decompiler, linked in the description. Launch the program, select the desktop 1.0 jar file for Slay the Spire, and wait for the program to finish. You've decompiled the code. You can now save it and explore it at your own pace. Most AAA games, and most commercial software in general, goes through some obfuscation processes to protect the code from decompilation. Even once decompiled, it's likely encoded so function and variable names are not readable. Slay the Spire, however, kept the function names and is surprisingly well self-documenting. With the exception of mod the Spire and base mod references, a lot of the code looks the same as what we've been writing. Now that we have references on how the game's cards work, let's try getting our own designs to work. For the Ironclad, I wanted to expand on the self-harm mechanics. I came up with an attack that deals damage based on how many times you've been hurt on your own turn, a skill that draws at the cost of life, and a power that heals based on the amount of damage taken this turn. The skill was simple, but I made the mistake of using the card's damage variable to store the damage. This variable is modified by strength, weakness, and even enemy vulnerability, so I just used my variable directly for the damage. It is worth noting that you can use either damage action with the damage type HP loss, or the lose HP action, but the latter is the better choice since it is more self-documenting. The power was also straightforward. At the start of the turn, it resets its damage counter to 0. When the player takes damage, it adds that damage to the counter, and at the end of the turn, it heals the player for half the amount of the counter, rounded up. I haven't tested to see what happens when I have multiple stacks yet, but I'll let you know if anything interesting comes. The game also crashes when I try to upgrade it, and I better add that to the bug list. The attack, surprisingly, has given me a lot of trouble. Wrathful Strike, with a cost of 1, should scale based on damage taken on your turn. Blood for Blood has a similar effect, but also counts the number of times you're hit outside your turn. I want to count HP loss cards, thorns, curses and statuses, but not enemy attacks. Blood for Blood checks a variable in the player class called Damaged This Combat, which is the number of times the player has been damaged in the current round of combat. I searched the player, the room, the action manager, and anything else I could think of to try and find a value for how often the player has been damaged on their turn, but I could find no such variable. I turned to the Discord server to see if anyone else had the same problem. It turns out, yes. The answer? Make a custom power to keep track. This feels wrong. So I played around with some other options. The most hopeful was to keep track of this variable at all times in the main class. However, the closest hook I could find, receive on player damaged, only presents the raw damage information. The amount of damage actually received is not provided. We would need to do the math ourselves to remove armor and see if damage is dealt. Oh, and keep in mind that the player might have a buffer that prevents damage. And because we're hard coding all of this, it wouldn't be compatible with other mods that might add other ways to mitigate damage. Alright, I'll make a power for now and revisit this problem further down the line. I created a new power to keep track of the number of times damaged and exposed to the variable, then went into the main mod class and added a hook for the start of combat. Here, I check to see if the player has Wrathful Strike in their deck. If they do, then apply the power. In Wrathful Strike's on-use function, I created a temporary damage variable and set it to the card's damage. I then check to see if the damage count power is on the character. This is, thanks to the check we added to the mod's base class, redundant. But if the card gets added during a fight or the power is removed, then Wrathful Strike won't crash the game. If the power is on the player, get a reference to it and get the damage count number, multiply it by any modifiers, and add it to our temporary damage variable. Finally, add a damage action using the calculated damage to deal. While we're here, let's make sure to tag the card as a strike for this sweet, sweet perfected strike synergy. The damage count power isn't done yet, though, as we need to make sure that it only counts damage done on the player's turn. There doesn't seem to be any way to query for whose turn it is, so we'll have to keep track ourselves. In trying to do this, it turns out that the enemy's turn isn't counted as a turn for at start of turn and at end of turn functions. These refer only to the player's turn, so we can toggle the boolean true during at start of turn and set it to false during at end of turn. Build and test the cards. I'm thinking if we dig into base mod's code enough, we might be able to figure out how to add our own hooks and not need to have this weird utility power, but that wouldn't be beginner friendly. The Silent is well known for having discard mechanics, but I've never been able to make a discard themed deck work. What can we add to make this work? A straightforward attack that also discards a card is a place to start. There's 3 actions associated with discard. Discard at end of turn action, discard action, and discard specific card action. I initially thought the discard action was random, whereas the discard specific card action brought up the selection choice. Instead, discard action has a parameter to determine if it is random, so we'll use that. It feels a little bland. What if we added for block next turn? This is a power called next turn block power. It still feels a little janky, but it works to demonstrate how to discard a card. The unplayable cards that have an effect when discarded are neat, but always feel like dead draws to me. What if we use that functionality on a card that can otherwise be played? If you play this card, it'll be a basic defend, but discarding it gives you a dexterity. Turns out, all you need to do to add this to a card is add an override for the trigger on manual discard function. Any card can be discard friendly now, although I probably should still look up on how to make a card that can't be played. Looking into the game's decompiled source code, I can see that Reflex accomplishes this by returning false from the function can use. Well, that was straightforward. However, it is worth noting it still has code in the onUse function. This is likely for situations where a card is forcefully played, like off the top of your deck. For the power, I want to deal damage when we discard a card. To differentiate this from the Tingsha relic, let's make the damage dealt depend on the cost of the card discarded. This sounds fairly straightforward, but I'm having issues on the power determining when a card is discarded. The closest function I can find is on draw or discard, but it triggers when a card is drawn, discarded, and played. I have yet to figure out a workaround. I might have to scrap this idea entirely. I want to take a moment now and apologize for the delay in updates. My graphics card died at the end of June, and by the time I had the computer working again, local volunteer work started taking all of my time. Things like this happen, and I'm going to try not to be too hard on myself about it. But hopefully I can get things back on track for the channel. I did also work on some blue cards, but I'm going to save that for another video, given this one's length. I'm going to also be looking into the Watcher and how stances work for the next update. After that, I'll either work on events or encounters. Which would you rather I do first? I'd better get back to it, since these cards don't code themselves.